The Ghost in the Mirror by John Bellairs, Chapter 12. I thought we'd be home by now, Rosarita complained. Another whole week had passed. On the night that old Stoltzfus had met his end, Rosarita, Mrs. Zimmerman, Hilda, and Heinrich had struggled back through a raging snowstorm to the Weiss farm. They told the whole family about what the evil sorcerer had attempted to do. April 1st found the family practically snowbound, but the blizzard blew itself out in the afternoon. The next morning, Mr. Weiss and some neighbors rode out to the Stoltzfus farm. What they found there was more than enough to convince them that Stoltzfus, and not Grandpa Drexel, was the evil magician who had been plaguing the community. They discovered books of black magic and other magical paraphernalia, like black candles, human bones, and some wax figures. One of them resembled Grandpa Drexel. When these images were brought to him, he took them and performed some cleansing ritual. The next morning, Grandpa Drexel was out of bed and looking far healthier than Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita had ever seen him. The family later heard that 3 other people in the community who had been ailing made miraculous recoveries the same day. As for Stoltzfus, no trace of him could be found. Some thought he had fled after the terrible deeds had been discovered. Others guessed the truth, that dark forces had stolen him away. The 4 people who really knew, Rosarita, Mrs. Zimmerman, Hilda, and Heinrich, agreed it would be better never to tell the whole fantastic story. Many people might believe such a tale, but others would always think the 4 had lost their wits. Yet no matter what the people of the valley thought had happened to Mr. Stoltzfus, they seemed to feel that his disappearance improved the community. The weather improved too. That first week of April, the sun grew warm, and the snow really began to melt. The spring thaw was clearly upon them at last. At the end of the week's delegation of farmers and their wives came out to the Weiss farm with offerings of food and tearful apologies, which Mrs. Weiss apparently enjoyed more than anything else she had experienced in a long while. The Weisses would not have to move after all. Grandpa Drexel's life had been saved, and yet Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita received no signal that they could return to their own time. There must still be unfinished business, Mrs. Zimmerman said. One other deed that Granny Weatherby's ghost wanted us to perform. But what it is, I couldn't say. The 2 of them were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking steaming hot tea. Rosarita looked haggard and worn. I know Mom's going to kill me when I get home, she said. I've been gone for months. She'll never trust me to visit you again. She reached into her jeans pocket and took out a crumpled piece of paper. As for unfinished business, do you think it might be this stupid treasure? Mrs. Zimmerman picked up the paper and unfolded it. Rosarita had told her about the fracture writing, and she had looked at the original, but she could not figure out the meaning. It could be, she said. She wrinkled her face. It isn't a very good poem, is it? It stinks, Rosarita said. I mean, look at how he spells live. It looks like the Roman numeral 54. She broke off and grabbed the paper. My gosh, that's it! She dashed away from the table and ran through the house, screaming for Heinrich and Hilda. The 2 of them came together with Mr. and Mrs. Weiss and Grandpa Drexel. What is it? Mrs. Weiss asked. Such screaming and yelling and laughing you make. You would think a young man had asked your papa for your hand. Rosarita thumped the copy of the poem down on the table. I solved the puzzle, she said. Look, it isn't the code at all. It's just the way you read the poem. The first word of each line going top to bottom. The first shall find riches. She had a pencil stub in her jeans pocket. She pulled it out and underlined the first word of each line like this. Step, live, paces, north. From cottage, rock, then line, great tree, and mountain. Dig for treasure. Herman Weiss blinked and slowly read aloud. Step 54 paces north from cottage, rock, then line, great tree, and mountain. Dig for treasure. Well, what do you know? Papa, said Mrs. Weiss. The great tree must be the old oak that your mother would never let you and your brothers cut down. I'll get the shovels, Mr. Weiss said. The directions were still not terribly clear, but after a day of digging, Herman Weiss shouted in excitement. From a hole they had dug, he and his sons hauled up a wooden chest bound with brass that had long since turned green with age. They pried off the rusted lock. When they opened the chest, hundreds of golden coins gleamed up at them. Now, said a happy, panting Heinrich, we are too rich to have to move forever. Rosarita and Mrs. Zimmerman had stood watching the proceedings. They followed the treasure hunters back to the house, the men staggering under the tremendous weight of the golden trove. The whole family crowded around the kitchen table, where Mr. Weiss excitedly began to count and stack the coins, but Mrs. Zimmerman and Rose Rita lingered in the doorway, feeling wistful and sad. "Come," said a kindly voice whispered. "I have something to show you." Grandpa Drexel, looking spry. It was Grandpa Drexel looking spry again. He led them upstairs to his room. He closed the door and had them sit down. "As you know, the neighbors destroyed all the magical items they found at Stoltzfutz's place," Grandpa Drexel said. "All but the wax dolls and this." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small round mirror. He handed it to Mrs. Zimmerman. "I have removed the evil spell that was cast over it. It is a good mirror now. I think a friend of yours has something to say to you. I will wait outside." He rose and shuffled out. Rosrita stood up and looked over Mrs. Zimmerman's shoulder. The round mirror, much smaller than the square one, had a rosy glow in its depths. Slowly the glow intensified, and then, suddenly, a beautiful old woman's face looked out. Her hair was snowy white, and deep lines etched her face, but the black eyes were bright and lively. Rosrita felt rather than heard the words the woman in the mirror spoke. "Thank you, my Florrie. You have righted the great wrong. Now you may return to your own time, and you may find what you wanted. For the last time, dear Florrie, goodbye." "Wait!" Mrs. Zimmerman said. But the mirror went dark, and a moment later it popped. A zigzag line now ran across it. Mrs. Zimmerman sighed. "The mirror cracked from side to side," she said. Then she stood up briskly. "Bessie is waiting for us," she told Rosrita, "and there's no time to lose." They did not pause to say goodbye to the excited Weiss family. Only Grandpa Drexel saw them off. Rosrita felt a little tearful. "I wanted to tell Hilda how much I liked her," she said, "and I never really thanked Heinrich. If he hadn't been such a good shot when he threw that sword, I wouldn't even be up here." They know how you feel," Grandpa Drexel said kindly. "Now you must hurry. These things don't happen every day, you know. So go back to your home, and remember, you must believe hard with all your heart to get there." He waved farewell to them. The weather had become spring-like, and the long walk to Fuller's Hill was a warm one. They toiled up the road until they found the right clump of rhododendrons, and then they climbed into Bessie. "I doubt if she'll even start after all this time," Mrs. Zimmerman grumbled. The car was a mess outside, with dirt and leaves and bird droppings all over it. It smelled lonely and cold inside, because the thick bushes had kept the warming sun off it. "Well," said Mrs. Zimmerman, "here goes nothing." The engine started on the first try. Mrs. Zimmerman revved it, and the radio crackled with static. Mrs. Zimmerman smiled. "One down now to get out of here." She carefully backed the Plymouth out, and after a few minutes of maneuvering, turned it around. They crept back up the track. Soon they saw where the old mountain road curved hard to the left, away from the granite cliff. "What did Mr. Drexel say?" Mrs. Zimmerman asked. "Believe with all your heart?" "Well, right there is where the tunnel would be, if there were a tunnel, and so I believe we'll head right for that cliff. Are you with me?" Rosrita swallowed. "Sure," she said. "Here we go." Mrs. Zimmerman wasn't kidding. She stomped on the accelerator, and Bessie leaped forward. The cliff seemed to roar toward them, faster and faster. Rosrita grabbed the armrest and held it tight. I believe, she told herself. She wanted to close her eyes, but if she did, the rock wall was just ahead of them. Zoom! The car made that funny sound that cars make when they plunge into tunnels, and for an instant everything went dark. Then fluorescent lights flashed above the car, and a semicircle of hot summer daylight glared ahead of them. In a moment, they burst out into the open air. On the radio, an excited announcer bellowed, "Clyde Vollmer blasted over the fence. What a game. A grand slam home run for Vollmer and the Red Sox to take it 8-4 after 16 innings. "We're back!" Rosrita screeched. "We're really and truly back." Mrs. Zimmerman pulled Bessie onto the shoulder. Her hands were shaking. "We are," she said, "and that's the same baseball game we were listening to weeks and weeks ago. Not a day has passed in 1951. Oh, thank you, Granny Weatherby." The two of them had some planning to do. Rosrita wanted to go straight to New Zebedee. She felt as if they had been away from home for weeks. However, Mrs. Zimmerman pointed out that as far as the world knew, they had not missed a day. In the end, Rosrita reluctantly agreed that they should go ahead with their tour, just as if nothing had happened. So they turned around, after a moment's hesitation, they went through the tunnel again. This time they came out still on a modern highway. They found the site of the Weiss farm, because Cottage Rock still loomed there off to the left of the highway, and now the farm was a small village named Weissburg. They drove in and found it to be a charming little place. They ate at Harry and Betty Weiss's cafeteria, and Mrs. Zimmerman talked to the owners. Harry Weiss was clearly a relative of Herman's. He had the same broad red face and blue eyes. Harry told them that his family had lived here for ages, and he told them where the family cemetery was, not far outside of town. After some searching, Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosrita found an old graveyard, and after rambling through it, they paused before a grave with an elegant marble headstone that read, Wilhelm Peter Drexel, 1751 to 1844, beloved stepfather. Rosrita felt very sad, but Mrs. Zimmerman said, He lived his full span. He wasn't cut off in 1828. We actually changed history, and it wasn't all a dream or a hallucination. But she must have felt sad, too, because they didn't look for any other graves. The two of them continued their Penn Dutch vacation. They spent a couple of days in Stonebridge, where in a junk shop, Mrs. Zimmerman found a broken old lamp with a base supported by 3 bronze claws. Griffin's talons, she said. Griffin's talons, or I don't know my talisman. Well, it won't give light, but griffins can be lucky animals to have around, so I'll pay a quarter for it. The two of them enjoyed their vacation. The dark clouds of fear and despair had cleared, but a little sorrow still lingered in Rosrita's heart. On their last night in Pennsylvania, in another tourist cabin, Mrs. Zimmerman suggested a game of chess. Rosrita just shook her head and sighed. All right, young lady, that's it, Mrs. Zimmerman said. You're just about as much fun as a toothache, Rosrita. What, in heaven's name, is the matter with you? With a miserable expression on her face, Rosrita said, It's just that I messed everything up. I was going to be so smart. I snooped around and got hexed by old Stoltzfus. Then I fooled with magic and nearly got eaten by a demon. Then I did it again and nearly got Heinrich and myself killed. I shouldn't be trusted to do anything alone. I guess I need a keeper, Mrs. Zimmerman snorted with irritation. Nonsense. Now listen carefully, because I will only say this once. Everything you did because you were trying to help Grandpa Drexel or the Weisses or me. So what if it didn't work out as you planned? You tried. That's the important thing. And when everything went wrong, you coped with your troubles. Rosrita blinked. But I should have asked for your advice and help. Mrs. Zimmerman held up a hand for silence. Rosrita, I will not always be around to help and advise you. A time comes when everyone must act all alone. That time came for you on this trip, and you were unselfish and determined and brave. Rosrita blinked. Do you mean I'm on my own from now on? Mrs. Zimmerman threw her head back and laughed. Of course not, you silly Billy. What did you tell me so long ago? I'm your friend through thick and thin. With a sniffle and a smile, Rosrita completed their rhyme. To the bitter end, we'll see the bad times out and the good times in. That's right, Mrs. Zimmerman said, smiling. Well, the same goes here. She put her hand out. Shake on that. Rosrita took her friend's hand, and from then on everything was all right again. The next day they drove back through Stonebridge and up Fuller's Hill, just before they got to the tunnel that had once disappeared on them. Rosrita had Mrs. Zimmerman pull off the road. I don't know why you want to stop here, complained Mrs. Zimmerman. I mean, I don't think we're going to go in this side and come out on the other in 2051 or anything. Rosrita climbed out of the car. Traffic was very light on this hot August day. The cliff was familiar, and yet it was different too, because the last time she had been here had been on a moonlight night in late winter. But finally she found what she was searching for. Very faint and ancient scratches showed on the rock face, long, straight horizontal lines and vertical ones. They made a big cross on the rock, and at the center of the plus sign was a small green cushion of moss. Get me something to dig with, said Rosrita. They made do with a screwdriver. What Rosrita had hidden was still there after all those years, at the bottom of a little pocket of earth packed into a natural hole in the rock. Rosrita stood back. Grandpa Drexel said that you would have to be the first one to touch it, reach in and get it. With a questioning look, Mrs. Zimmerman carefully put her hand down into the hole. She pulled out something about the size of a golf ball. After she used a tissue to clean off the dirt, she found herself holding a crystal orb. Rosrita, what is this? She asked in a tremulous voice. Something Grandpa Drexel made just for you. Mrs. Zimmerman stood speechless with the crystal cupped in her hands. It flickered a beautiful deep purple that shone clear and bright even in the summer sun. Why, Rosrita, she murmured, I don't know how to thank. And then Rosrita and Mrs. Zimmerman were hugging each other tight and laughing like maniacs. 1 or 2 cars went by, but none of them stopped. It was just as well. This was a very private moment of happiness, meant to be shared. just by two old friends. And that's the end of chapter 12.